I want to thank you all for coming today. My name is Glenn Corbett. I'm an associate professor of fire science here at John Jay, but I'm also the director of the Academy for Critical Incident Analysis, which is the primary sponsor of today's event. ACIA is a multidisciplinary research entity here within the college. It looks at obviously critical incidents from a variety of different kinds of perspectives, particularly trying to figure out, how it's changed public policy and changed public perceptions of what's going on around us. This event is also co-sponsored by the Christian Reaganhart Center for Emergency Response Studies as well. So again, on behalf of both organizations, I want to thank you for coming today. Why are we here today? Well, we're here today to listen to what I know is going to be an incredibly interesting presentation by our speaker, Jay Aronson. I have to admit that I read the book when it came out, and I can tell you that from my own perspective, that I think he's done a very good job on documenting what happened, and particularly in a very objective manner as well. So this is a story that, as you all know, because a lot of you are perhaps even in the book or obviously know the issues at hand here. This is a very contentious set of issues and problems over the last 15 years. So in any case, I'm looking forward to hearing, or as we all are, from Jay. And he's going to go for about 45 minutes, and at the end we'll have a Q&A session. And then following that, he did bring some copies of the book here. John Jay College, as most colleges, doesn't have a bookstore anymore. We're all virtual now, so he's now the bookstore. And as well as the author. So, yes, he doesn't want to drag him back home. So, okay, there you go. So let me give you a little background on Jay. Jay is the founder and director of the Center for Human Rights Science at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. He's also an associate professor of science, technology, and society in the history department. His research and teaching focus on the interaction of science, technology, law, and human rights in a variety of contexts. He recently completed a long-term study of the ethical, political, and social dimensions of post-conflict and post-disaster identification of the missing and disappeared, of course, what we're going to be talking about today, and has been involved in various projects to improve the quality of civilian casualty recording and estimation times of conflict. This work was funded by generous grants through the U.S. National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. Jay is currently being supported by Humanity United, the MacArthur Foundation, and the Oak Foundation to facilitate collaborations between technologies and human rights practitioners. The goals of these partnerships are to develop better tools and approaches to acquiring, authenticating, analyzing, and archiving human rights-related video and images. His work in this domain also explores the extent to which the democratization of human rights documentation through global spread of social media and mobile phones with cameras is leading to an increase in accountability and the prevention of atrocities. Jay's previous research focused on the development of and use of forensic DNA identification in the American criminal justice system. His first book, entitled Genetic Witness, Science, Law, and Controversy in the Making of DNA Profiling, was published by Rutgers University Press in 2007. That book examined the development of forensic DNA analysis in the American legal system. His next book on the recovery, and of course this is actually his current book, I pulled this off the website, his current book is what we're going to hear about today. And he, just a little background academically, he received his PhD in history of science and technology from the University of Minnesota, and was both a pre- and postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. So, without any further ado, let's all welcome Jay Aronson.
Thanks, Glenn. It's actually intimidating to be presenting something to an audience that probably knows more about the topic than I do. So I'll do my best to sound authoritative and correct me if I get anything wrong. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I've given this talk to a variety of audiences, none of them as knowledgeable as you. So I tend to be a little bit more general, and I allow the specificities to come out in the questions. So feel free to ask and to push and to critique what I'm saying, either during the talk or after. It doesn't matter to me. I'm going to try and be slightly more brief than 40 minutes because what I found when I talk about this set of issues is that the questions often bring out much more interesting detail than anything that I would just, tell someone in a presentation like this. I think that will. I think that's where the interesting part will come out. So as Glenn was mentioning, this book emerged from a larger project that I had been working on for quite a while on the ethical and political dimensions of the identification of the missing after conflict and disaster. At the core of this project was an effort to understand what happens when large numbers of people go missing after conflict or disaster, and what the impact of identifying them or not identifying them has on social reconstruction and the long-term stability of a society. The main case studies in that project were Argentina, Bosnia, Cambodia, Chile, Guatemala, Rwanda, and South Africa. Not all of them done by me, but with collaborators. And I think that we can add Syria to that list, and Libya and many other countries in the Middle East. When I started this, I hoped that there wouldn't be as many examples to work on as there were at the time, but it seems like the problem is just growing. So history demonstrates that not accounting for the dead often comes back to haunt societies down the road. Sometimes the problems come back years later, and sometimes it may take decades or even centuries for these issues to reemerge. Unidentified remains are often a source of tension among competing political or ethnic factions and are mobilized politically to demonstrate victimhood and therefore the legitimacy or illegitimacy of a particular group's claim to power. Claims about whose bodies are in mass graves can also serve as the basis for land claims. So we see this a lot in the former Yugoslavia and in many other places as well. In most cases I've examined, a lack of resources and political will hampers the recovery, identification, and memorialization process. I initially conceived of the World Trade Center recovery effort as a success story about what can happen when appropriate resources are marshaled for the effort. The deeper I got into the story, though, the more I realized that that framing, this kind of success in the midst of failure, was completely wrong. Although there were certainly many positive dimensions of the recovery, especially in the context of the scientific process through which remains were identified, the World Trade Center recovery effort was fraught with controversy at every level. And again, I don't think this is anything that anyone in this room doesn't already know. Sometimes people don't know about it, so excuse me if I go into some of the things that you already know. There were contradictory motives, imperatives, ideologies. There were outsized egos that meant that the process was anything but smooth. And again, as I don't need to tell anyone in the room, there were this set of conflicting needs, desires, interests, beliefs caused undue pain to survivors and families of victims, and embarrassment, whether they felt it or not, to city officials, and also, I think, the New York public, the people who lived in and around Manhattan and in the tri-state area, and in some cases, the nation. So one little historical caveat that I often include here is that the story that I'm going to talk about is in many ways a modern story. The desire to account for the dead after conflict or disaster is actually relatively new in Western society. There are examples in Greek and Roman literature and in the Middle Ages, but for the most part, it's only been since the US Civil War in our country and even World War I in Europe that we've wanted to identify those who have died after a conflict. When you look at what happened in battles for much of history, the dead were actually just left on the ground to be eaten by scavengers and for people to come and pick whatever valuables may have been there. So this is something fundamentally new, and I can go into some of the historical explanations for why this is the case. Oops, sorry. I hope the pictures don't bother anyone. Again, this is stuff I normally show to people who aren't directly connected to the story. We all know that the attacks caught everyone off guard. The initial response at the site was nothing short of frantic and an often uncoordinated effort to locate survivors, and within a day or so to try and recover the remains as quickly as possible. Suffice it to say that nobody had experienced such devastation, particularly in an urban area like New York. You had two 110-story buildings collapsing into the space of 11 stories, 7 of which were underground. The site was a tangle of steel beams weighing thousands of pounds, rebar, pulverized concrete, asbestos fiber, plus the contents of thousands of offices and retail outlets. The fire department of New York quickly came to control the site that was initially known as the pile and eventually the pit, and this had a profound impact on the forensic recovery effort. City medical examiners and the medical examiner's office and the anthropologists who work there and also other anthropologists in the community were unable to give advice on how to extract remains, and so the medical community was forced to passively receive what was brought to them. It soon became clear to those in charge that thoroughly searching debris for remains, and I'm talking about human remains here, at the World Trade Center site would be too challenging and time-consuming, so the city made a decision to haul the rubble to Fresh Kills landfill for more careful processing. The decision was certainly a boon to efficiency, but many families, including some here, were sickened by this decision. This led many of them into the world of activism for the first time in their lives. And so when I'm talking to other audiences, I often spend a great deal of time talking about how normal most of the families who became activists were. They didn't have a history of activism. There was nothing in their past that would suggest that they would sort of move into a antagonistic position to the city or federal efforts to clean up the World Trade Center site. A group calling itself World Trade Center Families for a Proper Burial even sued the city to demand that the finest debris stored at Fresh Kills, which almost certainly contained unidentifiable human remains, be returned to the World Trade Center site after the sifting was over, or later to a more dignified location. This legal action would go all the way to the Supreme Court, which declined to reconsider the special 9/11 court's conclusion that families had no ownership claim over remains that could not specifically be linked to a particular family. And this story is where I normally begin to talk about the kind of insensitivity that we see on issues of human remains from government officials. The judge in this case, Judge Alvin Hellerstein, who was in many ways quite sympathetic to the families in their requests about where the remains would be held in perpetuity, described the find material as an undifferentiated mass of dirt. And for people who believed that their loved ones were in this, that there were parts of their loved ones in this material, hearing something like that actually was quite emotionally hurtful and didn't do anything to make them feel better about what was going on at the site. Sorry, these are just a couple of pictures. So this is the material from Fresh Kills, or at Fresh Kills, that had been hauled to the site by barge and truck. And if anyone's interested in that process, I can talk about it. There were lots of problems with the way that that was handled. There were technical problems, there were logistical problems, but the idea was to clear the site as quickly as possible. And I'll talk a little bit about why that was politically desirable for the people involved in a few minutes. But these are just these grapplers, these large grapplers that were used to separate the material so that it could be searched. And then here's this is recycling machinery that's been repurposed to sift through these remains. And I also remind people that in addition to human remains, and some people would argue even more important than human remains, the World Trade Center, and the Twin Towers had this and still have in our mind this reputation of being centers of finance, like the beating heart of capitalism. But in reality, it was quite hard to rent much of this space, so there were government agencies that had offices and storage facilities there, including the Secret Service, the DEA, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, and others that I can't actually remember. And so there were hundreds of thousands of dollars, I can't remember the exact amount, maybe more than that. There were guns, there was drugs, there were all kinds of contraband and things that needed to be recovered by the federal government here. And so in addition to searching for the remains, they were also trying to recover all of this loot, this material. And so that's what was going on at Fresh Kills. Police badges, all kinds of identifications, all kinds of stuff. I don't know that. So again, I talk about the families were concerned that the entire process was moving too quickly, that efficiency was the goal of the cleanup rather than finding remains or showing dignity to those who had died. And so you get into differences of opinion very quickly about whether things happen too quickly. The process came in under budget, and so there are many families who say that the money should have been better spent and the process should have been slowed down, and this should have happened at the site, not at a place called Fresh Kills, which has a very, it just sounds wrong to be sifting remains at a place called Fresh Kills. Whether or not this was the best place for it or not is a different story, but it has a kind of, it rubbed families the wrong way in many ways. Okay. So efficiency gains associated with searching for remains at Fresh Kills meant that the cleanup effort was completed well ahead of schedule in this late spring of 2002. There were 2,753 officially recognized victims, plus the terrorists. There were 9, I think. I'm blanking on the number. Is that, you probably know better. Is it not? I think there may have been 9. I can't remember the exact number anymore. Of these, of the 2,753 victims, 293 were recovered as mostly complete bodies, along with 22,000 fragments. And so when I say fragments, sometimes these were limbs or torsos. In a couple of cases, these were almost complete bodies, but not quite reaching mostly complete. And sometimes they were just small bits of flesh or bone. And I will show one picture of a bone that was recovered later, just to give, I do this to give people a sense of what was recovered in the ballast in the second recovery effort. So this graph is done by the Phoenix unit of the Fire Department of New York, and it gives you a sense of where remains were recovered. So you can see, this is the 16-acre area. The towers are here, and so you can see that most remains are concentrated really in this half of the 16-acre site, and that would become important when in debates over how much of this site should remain undeveloped, or there should be a memorial and museum, and later a museum placed on the site. So, yeah. A defining moment in the recovery effort came shortly after the attacks, when Chief Medical Examiner Charles Hirsch promised families that he and his colleagues would do more than confirm the identity of the individuals who were killed on September 11th. This was actually the standard operating procedure of most previous disaster recovery efforts. Your goal is to try and confirm that people who were thought to be at the site were actually there. So when you think of something like a plane crash, you generally have a list, a closed manifest, so you know who was on the plane. And the job of the medical examiner or the investigator is actually to find some remain of each of those people to confirm that they were actually on the flight. And this kind of promise had never before been made. No medical examiner or investigator had ever said, we are going to test every single remain to see if we could return it to the family and figure out who it belonged to. So as I mentioned, the medical examiner said that he would attempt to identify and return to families every human body part recovered from the site that was larger than a thumbnail, and would continue these efforts forever as new techniques and methods emerged. It's important to recognize, whatever you think about Charles Hirsch and whatever you think about the medical examiner's office, the initial group of personnel who were charged with identifying the missing there had a very personal connection to the site. Many of them were actually there as the first tower fell. Some of them were injured or nearly lost their lives, so they felt a bond of kinship with the families. And I do mention to other audiences that in late 2004, many of this first group left because they either burned out or they were ready to move on to other professional challenges. and a new group of personnel came in who had no emotional connection to the site or to the families. Obviously, again, whatever you think about them, they did care about identifying the missing and about returning remains, but they didn't have a kind of relationship that the first group had. Hirsch was there for a while longer, but there were many, there were many people, Amy Mundorf being one. There were lots of people who really felt a kinship with the families, and that changed in 2004 into 2005, and that led to a set of controversies and disagreements that further soured the feeling of many families about the recovery effort. This identification effort would have been impossible without DNA technology. It was hugely expensive. So the only number that I've actually been able to find, and I've asked several people whether it's accurate. I haven't gotten a definitive response, but something like $80 million was spent on the identification effort as of 2011. I don't know how much. They've retested some remains. I don't know exactly how many. I don't know what exactly has happened since 2011. It's hard to find out. But we know that a lot of money has been spent on this recovery effort. The promise that Hirsch made to identify all remains has actually also affected the way that the unidentified and unclaimed remains are stored. So if you look at previous disasters or even terrorist attacks or military remains, at a certain point, a decision is made that we can't figure out who this person is, or we're going to say administratively that we can't figure out who this person is. So they're laid to rest in a dignified manner permanently. Doesn't always stay that way. We know Michael J. Blasey, the Vietnam killed in action. He was a soldier killed in action. He was shot down, and he was in the Tomb of the Unknowns at Arlington Cemetery. It was actually kind of known the whole time who he was, but they needed to provide a set of remains, so they gave his for a variety of reasons. But eventually, he was pulled out. His remains were disinterred, and he was identified, and he's no longer there. So sometimes this kind of permanent burial gets disturbed. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but the idea is that the remains in the World Trade Center context are never going to be completely put to rest. They'll remain in a scientific repository at the site of the at the site of the World Trade Center, behind a wall of the museum, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Again, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
You say it's a scientific repository, but there is no work done in the basement of the memorial.
No, there isn't a laboratory there, of course, but they're stored in a...
But there's nothing there, zero. I don't even think there's a laboratory there. In the beginning, they said that to try to justify why the remains were brought down there, but any testing is done, they're shipped back.
They bring it to the lab. Yeah, of course, they bring it back to the lab.
So there's absolutely zero reason to have the remains down there. I just want to...
Yeah, well, I'll talk about differences of opinion about why the remains are there. Yeah, so.
There's one reason that many of the families believe, and I do, that's because it's a tourist
Yeah.
trap and it attracts curious
Yeah.
visitors from other countries.
Yeah.
They're willing to pay $24.
I'll show a picture of the wall, and I will bring that up, and I'll talk a little bit about why the decision was made initially to put the remains there. So there's a question about whether the storage of remains at the museum behind this wall impedes the ability of families to both mourn their loved ones and to kind of make sense of the situation, and move on is the wrong word, closure is the wrong word, but to integrate the death of their loved one into their lives and to be at peace with how the remains are being stored. So this is this is an open question, and we can talk about that in the Q&A session. So just a little bit of where are we now? Oh, okay. So some of you are here. Just a bit of biographical diversion. At the time of September 11th, I was in the midst of writing my dissertation on the development of DNA identification within the American legal system. And initially, I followed the recovery effort like most other Americans. When it was on the front page of the New York Times, I paid attention, or the Boston Globe, where I was at the time. But I didn't really, I didn't pay extra attention to the story. Let's just put it that way. But as DNA became more central to the story, I started following a little bit more what was going on. Many of the people I was interviewing were involved in the kinship analysis panel that was advising OCME on statistics. So I started talking to them about that. But I have to be honest and tell you, I had absolutely no intention of writing about it. It was the furthest thing from my mind. If you told me that, 15 years later, I would be standing up giving a talk about September 11th, I would have told you were crazy. What changed my mind, though, and what really got me interested was reading about the efforts of families who were challenging the way that New York was handling the remains issue, beginning with the rapid recovery effort and sifting at fresh kills, and then how unclaimed and unidentified remains would be stored in perpetuity. So it was really the families that got me involved. And I have to be totally honest, I just couldn't understand why this group of families was being so vocal and so antagonistic towards the city when it seemed like the city had the best of intentions, and that there were all kinds of other things going on that were preventing the city from doing their job. But who were these families who were doing crazy things like this? Like, what was going on with them? And I wanted to understand them better, and so that's what really motivated me to get involved. I was also fascinated by how a coalition of families, some of which are not a coalition anymore, were using the chart, the FDNY chart, a couple of minutes ago, to make claims about which parts of the site ought to be considered sacred ground and set aside for a memorial. Although many relatives initially demanded that all 16 acres be set aside, the economic and political symbolism of the site made that unlikely and, quite frankly, untenable or impossible. The families and city officials eventually settled on 8 acres that included the Twin Towers footprints and encapsulated the area where the majority of remains were recovered. Commentators and city officials claimed very publicly that active families were behaving irrationally or out of grief, but I really wanted to understand their perspective. I wanted to get a sense of who are these families and why were they behaving in the manner that they were behaving. And what I discovered is that their concerns were based in reality and reflected legitimate political, moral, and economic problems that they had identified with the recovery and redevelopment of the site. And that's not the conclusion that I lead with, but that's the first conclusion that I came to. Basically, that these people weren't crazy. The people in the slide before, which for audiences who are kind of coming at this fresh, I don't really think they understand just how pilloried the families were in the media. There were some sympathetic journalists, and others were less sympathetic, and city officials were dismissive of the families and their concerns. So what I argue in my book, which is there, and if you don't have a copy, please buy it, because I don't want to lug it home. I lugged it here. I'll take whatever you have. I argue that it's crucial to understand the context in which all of these events were taking place. Specifically, the very public disaster, and I mean that in a different sense than the disaster that initially took place, but the very public disaster that took place when the Lower Manhattan Development Council first tried to put together a site plan for the redevelopment effort, and the feeling that most families were not allowed meaningful participation in the memorial design competition, along with massive and very public budget overruns and showdowns between the city, the LMDC, the Memorial and Museum Foundation, which is a story in and of itself, which I'm not going to tell in great detail, the Port Authority and Larry Silverstein, the developer who had just signed a 99-year lease on the site a few weeks before the attacks. Okay, cool. Throughout the recovery effort, and I'm getting back to this issue of whether the initial recovery happened too quickly. Throughout the recovery effort, firefighters and other uniformed service personnel involved in the search for human remains worried that the cleanup was proceeding too quickly for them to do a good job. They blamed the political ambitions of the politicians in control of the recovery. First, Rudy Giuliani, who is in the news again, maybe out of the news again. It's hard to tell what's going on with him, but George Pataki, who's no longer in the news, who was the governor at the time, and Michael Bloomberg, who was elected mayor at the end of Giuliani's term. And so these are all three very powerful New York men who had ambitions on becoming president. And I think, just as an aside, if you told me which powerful, ambitious New York man would end up being elected president in 2016, I would have laughed. I would have chosen any of these three guys first before I picked Trump, but that's a different story. There was actually little tangible evidence to back up this claim that the recovery effort had proceeded too quickly until 2005, when environmental abatement specialists discovered bone fragments on the top of the Deutsche Bank building across the street from the World Trade Center site as it was being inspected in preparation for demolition work. And then, shortly thereafter, utility workers discovered several bones and manholes around the site that were being opened up to repair and reconnect electrical and telecommunications connections from their sources to the site. Because remember, when the towers fell and everything was cleared out, all of the connections that had connected all of the offices and spaces in the World Trade Center site to the world were lost. And so as you're redeveloping, when you're redeveloping the infrastructure, you actually have to go find those wires and splice new ends onto them and get them into the site. Oh, so I just wanted to show you. So this is this is a month-by-month assessment of how many remains had been recovered. So you see, obviously, the bulk of remains were, or the bulk of remains were found in 2001 into, so between September 2001, this might be October 2001, and May of 2002. And then there were a couple of remains found, I think in late 2002, if I remember correctly, and one there. And then all of a sudden you see this new burst of activity. And what's going on. And this is something that actually shocks people who don't know anything about this story. They're shocked when I show them this graph. So I don't quite get the shock effect here, because most of you, again, know the story better than I do. But it was something that it's a big surprise. So then these new finds in the Deutsche Bank building and also in adjacent buildings and in the manholes led to a significant effort to research areas around the site, including the ballast from adjacent roofs. And ballast is just rock that's placed on top of on the roof of a building to hold down the plastic membrane that keeps the rain out. It's the simplest way of putting it. Many new remains were found, including several complete limb bones. Those are the ones that were found in the manholes. I mean, these are like, big bones. And again, the story of how these bones were actually found, it wasn't as simple as like you open it up and, oh, there are bones, what's going on? It's a much more complicated process. And if not for basically chance, many of the remains would not have been found. It wasn't like they were systematically recovered. It was utility workers or environmental abatement specialists cleaning spaces up, finding things that were never found 3 years previously or 4 years previously. Things really took a turn for the worse, though, when construction workers began to discover remains in areas that were said to be searched by the city in 2001 and 2002. These discoveries left activist families totally demoralized, and they demanded that the U.S. military's human remains recovery team take over the operation to ensure that it was carried out in a scientifically reliable manner. They had simply lost faith in the ability of the city to recover and identify remains. It's important, again, when you're trying to understand what led families to react the way they did, to remember that none of this happened in isolation. So it wasn't just the human remains. That wasn't all that was happening. And again, I try and explain to people who don't know the story that this was all taking place in the backdrop of a very public fight about what to build at the site, the memorial, all kinds of things. Whether the memorial quadrant should have just a memorial to September 11th and its victims, or whether there should be other institutions there that promoted world peace or art or other sorts of things. So there was a plan for something called an International Freedom Center that would document the kind of global human struggle for freedom from the beginning of time to the present. From slavery to terrorism and everything in between, plus a museum or a gallery that showed works of drawing. It was called the Drawing Center, I believe, and a theater. So these debates and battles were taking place at the same time that these new remains were being discovered. And when it appeared to families that there wasn't, that the people in charge weren't competent. So they don't exist in isolation. And that's one big point that I make, that science in isolation doesn't exist. Science is taking place in the context of a much broader set of things happening in law. There was the compensation question, in real estate, what do we rebuild here? And in politics, what are we doing in the name of these victims? And so I can't remember if I have it in here, but I teach a course on drone warfare and autonomous weapons systems at Carnegie Mellon. And one of the first things that I do is I have them read the Authorization of Military Force, which was signed into law, I think, on the 18th of September, about a week after September 11th. And we're bombing people in Somalia with drones in the name of 9/11 victims. So the same authorization of military force, we're going to go after the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan because they were the perpetrators of, they were the murderers of these victims. That authorization of military force is still being used today in places against people who have nothing to do with these deaths. And so this is it's an aside, but it's a political issue, that the victims of the World Trade Center attacks are still being used politically today to fight wars and to justify a variety of policies that some of us agree with and some of us don't. But we can't separate that from the issue of how do we remember these victims. And it's sometimes in Congress, it doesn't always make sense, but that's the reality, that none of this story is taking place in isolation. It isn't just about a bunch of families and their loved ones. It's a much bigger story. And so that I think for many people begins to provide some background and an explanation for why families are reacting, what it means to families. It's not just like, your aunt or your mother dies in her sleep, and you take the body to a mortician or whoever does your burial, and then you bury them and it's done. It's an ongoing thing. And interestingly, I again, another aside, I had a conversation with someone who lost her brother, I think, in the attacks. He was on one of the planes. And she was talking to me about the difference of losing her sister a few years before to a disease. And there was a kind of private mourning with her sister. And with her brother, it was a much different experience. It was a public death. And so I'll talk a lot about, in the end, I'll talk a bit about what it means when we try and memorialize public deaths, publicly and politically significant deaths. It's a different situation entirely. Okay. Oh, sorry, this is just ballast. I forgot, I got on too many tangents. This is sifting the ballast, debates about whether OCME did a good job. I'm not going to get into that. I could go off all day on tangents about things that probably or could have gone wrong, but I think that takes away from the story. If you want to read, you can read that in my book. So many people ask, like, what was found in the ballast? This is a typical fragment that was found within the ballast. So I think in this particular instance, I actually have a lot of sympathy for the people who were searching for remains. They were looking at the time for larger pieces. They weren't, they didn't feel like they had the time or the energy, quite frankly, or the personnel to search for things of this size. So hundreds of the fragments that were discovered in 2006 into 2007 were, were roughly this size. And you can see this was the 20,434th remain from disaster Manhattan of 2001, just so you know what's going on there. There were lots of large remains found, pieces of skull, all kinds of things. But many of the remains are like this because I don't want people to go away with the impression that they were like skeletons lying on roofs. That wasn't the case.
So this is a fragment of?
I don't know. It's probably a limb bone. I don't know exactly what it is. It's a bone fragment. Yeah. I think Brad Adams from OCME probably told me what it was, or it's in a book somewhere. I don't know what it is.
He's a pathologist?
We're not going to get into Brad. He's a he's a forensic anthropologist at OCME now.
I just have one
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
In your research, did you ever question the fact that initially after 9/11, whatever, we had 20,434 remains, and today it has mysteriously shrunk down to, what is it, Glenn? How many remains are they saying, 8,000?
Those are the remains that have not been returned, that remain unidentified or unclaimed.
But it doesn't compute, you know what I mean? Like, if someone got remains, most people just got a little piece. They didn't get.
Yeah. The way that this worked, again, many of you already know this in the room. After it very quickly became clear that families were going to be contacted several times because remains were found in different places at different times. So when you got your first remain, when you were contacted first, you got a form that said, when do you want to be contacted? After a year, I think it was, there was like a specific, time period, like after X number of years, when we conclude the first round of identifications or never. And this can change with next of kin. But many people said, I don't want any more remains. Don't give me any more remains. This is too painful. Or all I wanted to know was whether my son or my brother or my mother or my father was in the trade centers. And once you've given me one piece, I don't want the rest. So those are many of the remains that are in the repository are actually identified, but the family has declined to take them back. And there's actually one case in which the family received a small remain, I don't know what piece, and then,
They're all small.
yeah, and then a near, not quite a complete body, but a very complete portion of the body was recovered, and that family said, we don't want any more remains. And so that large remain is sitting in the repository. Eventually, the next of kin will die, and then a new next of kin will emerge, and they may say, I want what you have, and then they can return it. So there are something like 7,000 or 8,000 remains in the repository now. Those are remains that either families have said we don't want them. There's no identification possible. They have a partial or a complete DNA profile, but they have no direct or familial samples that match. Those might be illegal workers whose families were afraid to come in. I don't think they have all of the, they actually don't have all of the hijackers' DNA, so there might be some remains of hijackers that, they don't know. And also remains that have no, that right now we can't extract the DNA and recover and identify the source and return them to a family.
That's for the 1,100 people that remain.
Yeah, 1,134, I think, something like that. Yeah. So there are something like 8,000, and I have the totals in my book. I don't keep that kind of stuff in my mind, but yeah. So, all right.
How many different people have been identified, like with DNA?
How many so far?
Yes, how many different people have been identified?
1,640. Yeah, 1,640 out of 2,753 plus a few terrorists. So, and that's actually amazing. I mean, you have to take a step back and realize how amazing it is that many people have been identified. If things had been done differently, we would probably have a few more. I don't think a lot, maybe a couple hundred more, if the recovery of remains had been handled better, if more scientific procedures had been used by the fire department and others searching. We don't really know, but many of them, even when you have a bone, it's when you add heat and water to a human body or to any biological material, the DNA degrades rapidly. And so the conditions at the World Trade Center site were about as bad as you could get in terms of preserving DNA for subsequent recovery. So it's and it was quite an effort on the part of the OCME to actually get that far. Yeah.
Excuse me. In the process of this book, did you personally interview Bloomberg and de Blasio?
No, well, certainly not de Blasio. They wouldn't return my my requests for an interview. Nobody from the city returned my requests for an interview because I didn't have connections, and I was engaging in research that couldn't possibly make them look good. And so I've got a few more slides, but I will stop. I'll stop here for a second.
The reason I'm asking,
Yeah.
what just drives me crazy throughout this whole thing is the way we've been treated
Yeah.
by the political heads.
Yeah. And yeah, for sure.
It's just, for the life of me,
Yeah.
I mean, here's a group that these politicians should be jumping on.
Yeah.
Let me get these people. Let me support them.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
there's a group of voters out there that are going to eat me up if I do the right thing.
Yeah.
And instead, we're being treated like, as if, who the hell are you and what businesses are yours?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we are what's left of those people that
Yeah.
are down there
Yeah.
that are in a basement.
Yeah.
You know what you keep in your basement? You ask a person who owns a home, you have a basement, what do you keep there? I keep my junk there.
Yeah.
That's the way we feel.
Yeah.
The city is keeping their junk in the basement.
Yeah.
People every day walk over those remains, maybe unintentionally, maybe not directly, they're not putting their foot on the bones, but by process, they are walking across those remains.
Yeah.
And, for the political leaders to say, we don't think you're deserving of a special memorial, sarcophagus, whatever you want to call it, I try to understand how other people think.
Yeah.
For the life of me, I can't figure out what the hell is going on in their heads and why they're treating us like this.
So, I argue in my book. So I wasn't able to interview many of the city officials, but they spoke enough in public and they accidentally recorded enough of their conversations that it's pretty clear that their goal is to get the site, to get Lower Manhattan back on its feet and to return things to normal as quickly as possible for businesses and residents and tourists. And that's the reality. And, it's competing interest, and you can't please both groups. And again, I think my argument is that things could have and should have been done differently. And one of the things that I argue, and you can disagree with me, but it's that if you're going to ask families for input, you have to listen to it. And if you know you're not going to listen to it, then don't bother. Don't pretend to be democratic about the process. So the city could have said, listen, we know there are mourning families, but we have to get the city back up and running. And this is what we're going to do, and no one's going to stop us. But instead, that's what they said in private. And in public, they said, we want the families to talk to us. We want to hear what they have to say. We want to integrate their needs and their desires into the process. And you know as well as I do that they handpicked people who they knew or thought would say yes to what they wanted to do. And that's politics, and that's reality. And, I can say that's wrong as much as I want to say that's wrong, but that's politics. What I object to is a kind of farce of democracy and a farce of, integrating families' views. There actually were some things on which the families were listened to, but they were things that didn't get in the way of the larger mission. So, like names, there was a controversy about how the names were placed around the memorial, and they kind of sort of listened to families a little bit. So that there was an impact there, but there was nothing that was going to get in the way of returning Lower Manhattan to business and life. And there are differing opinions, and I actually, again, to be totally honest, I'm not quite sure where I sit on that debate. People ask me all the time, well, do you think the memorial is a good memorial? That I can say no. I don't really like the memorial. I don't think that it's a contemplative space. I certainly don't see much contemplation when I'm there. I've been there 5 times, and I've mostly seen tourism. So it's lots of selfies, and there are people kind of in thinking in a kind of memorial mode, but that's not the general feeling that I get. The museum, I don't think should be there, and I'm just telling you what I think now, because whatever, and then we can talk. The museum, I don't really think should be there, but I actually think the museum has done well for what it is. And again, you can disagree with me on that. I find it very moving. I've spent many hours, there. Should the remains be there? No. But they're out of sight and out of mind at ground level, and that was the goal. So, that's kind of how I feel about that. Do I think it's right? No. But that's, what happened. But in the future, if someone comes to me, if there's another similar disaster, the first thing I'll say is, first I'll say wait to build a memorial, because we don't really know what these events mean. Do something sensitive and sensible and temporary until you have enough distance to really make sense of what's going on. And if you're going to involve the families, you have to listen to them. If you have no plans to listen to them, just be honest about it and move forward. Don't get people's hopes up. You have people who spent a large portion of their adult lives pushing on a city that was never going to respond. And that just seems crazy to me. Yeah?
I wanted to finish the presentation, but
yeah.
One also piece of information, it doesn't have to do with the human remains, but the only place of worship that got annihilated during 9/11 was a very small Greek church.
Mm-hmm.
It was standing like
Yeah.
right next to
Mm-hmm.
St. Nicholas. And the archdiocese fought tooth and nail
Mm-hmm.
to have that church restored. It would be the only place
Mm-hmm.
and in the original plan they wanted to scrap the
Yeah.
compensate
Yeah.
for the past. So for 12 years, just before Occupy happened,
Mm-hmm.
held a few weeks before
Yeah.
Occupy started in September
Yeah.
2011, we also did a rally there
Mm-hmm.
for the park, asking for the rebuilding of St. Nicholas, because it was going
Mm.
12 years
Yeah.
that it was happening.
Yeah.
And eventually it did happen.
Yeah.
I happened to chant at the foundation of the church, which
Oh, wow. Oh.
I chant in Byzantine choir, so
Hmm.
I was up there. St. Nicholas, you can see it is on the south side
Mm-hmm.
of that, of the, yes, of the memorial
Mhm.
complex. And now it's been built by Santiago Calatrava,
Mhm.
famous
Yeah.
Spanish architect.
Yeah.
And it,
Oh, I didn't know he was doing it. Okay.
yeah, he was doing that,
Yeah,
and he's replicating. If you see, it's kind of like octagonal.
Yeah.
It reminds the Hagia Sophia in
Hmm.
Constantinople.
Hmm. Yeah.
That church, but the fight.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
that piece of history,
Mhm.
and that remains
Yeah.
so that I can.
Yeah. So, I think,
Can I just say
yeah.
something? In the early days, myself and some other family members were so happy to come to the services. They would have the temporary services from, the Greek church. And we supported them 100%. But as years dragged by and they played those games, the same games that they played with us, I tried to encourage some of the clergy to get a little more radical, because I knew that nothing would happen. I'm so glad that you had your rally. Once it gets into the New York Times,
Mhm.
boom,
Yeah.
you're going to have movement. That's the only thing they care about, is bad publicity, and especially in the Times. So congratulations, and I can't wait to go to the church.
And by the way, Pataki was there. Pataki was positive,
Mm. Mhm.
but Cuomo didn't want to.
Yeah. Hmm.
And Cuomo said finally, like a few days before the actual foundation, said all those bricks that have negotiators. That's all. Obviously,
Yeah. How much time do I have? I would just want to speed through what I have to say, because I think we're going to cover.
Yeah, so you're at 3:45 now, so
Okay, I'll finish up in 5 or 10 minutes. Is that okay? All right. We have till 4:30, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So as the what slide am I on? Okay. As the title suggests, my work is ultimately a story about the ownership and control of the dead and the World Trade Center site, physically, spiritually, in memory, and politically. Some, as I mentioned, some relatives did work with the city to achieve the goals of the city and their goals, while others tried to stop or redirect these actions because they felt they had no real say in the process. And again, when, I'm not going to go into it, but a lot of the actions of the family seem like reaction or publicity stunts. And I mentioned to audiences, well, that was the only option that many of these families had. If you weren't in the inner circle, you didn't have a voice, and so you had to do outrageous things that got people paying attention. That was the method that the families used to be a part. Yeah. So that was the method that the families used to raise their voice. And actually, it's quite frankly methods that we might have to start using sooner than we'd like if if there are things that are happening that we don't like. And I do say that both sides had influence. I think the families, I think you had an impact, not as much as you'd like, of course, but you did have an impact in many ways. And obviously families who worked on the side of the family had quite an impact as well. And I actually point people to Amy Waldman's book, The Submission, that gets into some of the personalities. I'd love to know if any of you have read it, what you think of it. It's a great, it's a story, it's a novel about what would have happened if the person who won the memorial competition was Muslim, and they initially try and choose another person, but there's one family member who believes in the process and says no and leaks that it's a Muslim architect. And it's a brilliant story because it gets at all of the personalities behind the people who didn't have, who couldn't be spoken of by reporters in the media in the way that many reporters would have liked to talk about them. So it gets in their personal motives, like the guy who's the head of the memorial, basically the competition director, wants to leave a legacy, wants to be remembered and wants to be historically important. And there's the kind of Maya Lin kind of character who is very self-important and absorbed, and all of these things. There are family members, so who may or may not, not all family members come off.
It's a similar story to what happened with the Vietnam War.
I would recommend reading the book. Some of you might not like the way that the families are portrayed, but it really tries to be honest about what motivated people, like the son of the firefighter who didn't really make it in life, whose brother was killed, who uses this as an opportunity to kind of gain meaning in his life, and all kinds of interesting stuff. You should read it, huh? It's called The Submission by Amy Waldman. She was a reporter who covered the recovery effort from the New York Times. All right. So much of my book focuses on the challenge of memorializing politically significant public deaths for families and bureaucrats. Sorry, this is just you've all been there. Okay, that's that. And I'm just going to skip this. I'm going to skip the story of the names. And I'm actually, so this is the picture. I think we've gotten into this enough. I bring this out. So this is the wall of the repository in the museum. How many of you have not been to the museum? No, have not.
Have not.
Oh, you have? Oh, yeah, I forgot. This is a group that's not going to go.
Yeah, never go.
So this is what it looks like. And you know what? I'm gonna be honest with you, and I'm potentially going to disagree with you on this. For what it is, it's a very well-designed museum. I'm telling you. I know you don't want to see. There's a lot of stuff that isn't there for a lot of different reasons.
That's a big part.
Yeah, there's a lot.
They rewrote 9/11.
Actually, from my take on it, they only wanted to talk about the actual event and the people who died. They don't want. They don't feel like they have a mandate to talk about anything else because families would be upset. I'm just telling you that you can agree or disagree with me.
Oh, wow.
So.
I have my own theory.
Yeah, of course. But that's that. But as far as telling the story of the day of 9/11.
They were looking for submissions. They wanted people to donate all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, about they wanted stuff that was about the victims and about the day, because they felt that families didn't want them to. They had been burned by the IFC and by other events, and they only wanted to talk about the events. And even the part about the terrorists is kind of off to the side for a variety of reasons.
And the admission charge to get in
And so it's $24. And so the controversy that I don't need. Yeah, I know. Families don't have to pay. Yeah. The International Freedom Center. So the idea that you could talk about things besides 9/11 at 9/11. So this museum originally wasn't there. It wasn't supposed to be part of the memorial, but there was a process by which there were tremendous budget overruns, like $2 billion to build this thing. And so there was an engineering process. Frank Schiami led an engineering process where the memorial and the museum that were once separate were merged together. And that's how you end up with the repository. Families, the Coalition of 9/11 Families, initially wanted the remains to be at the site. And they were placed at bedrock, which, you know, if you read transcripts and do some interpretation, you could perceive families wanting that kind of a thing. But never in the context of a museum, and never in a place where you had to pay $24 to enter. And so these are things that I don't even feel like I need to give this talk to you, but these aren't things that normal people think about. And when they hear, people are also shocked when they find out that it costs $24 to enter the museum. I mean, where do you have to pay $24 to enter a museum? I mean, I grew up in DC where museums were free, or like going to Europe as a student where you paid a few dollars and you went in. So, I mean, it's quite outrageous. And
well, when you have an $80 million budget, that's why.
Yeah. Well, you have an $80 million budget, and I mean, so one question I have for families who are here is, well, I mean, I know what many of you think, but should there even be a museum that tells the story at the site? I personally don't think it's necessary, but that's just me. So this is the site, and the blue. So when I went the first time, I had seen pictures of the rendering, and then I went the first time, and I was like, what the hell are all of these blue cards doing on the wall? And it seems like what they tried to do was disguise or to obfuscate the fact that it was a wall and there was a repository behind it. I'm not totally sure. The idea is that there are 2,753 shades of blue, or 3,000, and none of them exactly replicate the color of the sky on that day of 9/11. It's weird, and they're not lined up properly, so you can kind of see. It's just it's a weird setup. Anyway.
Did they allow you to take photos?
No, this is a stock. This is a stock photo.
Well, I understand that you can't take any photos.
I'm not going to say anything. And there were also huh? I think I wasn't. Yeah, I was going to say I took photos, but I couldn't remember if it was okay or not. I mean, I've got hundreds of photos, so I just didn't want to say on camera. I didn't remember the rule. But anyway, so this is the wall. Again, you know, there's a tiny plaque. I think it's there that says behind this wall lie the remains of the victims of the World Trade Center, unclaimed and unidentified. It's quite tasteful if you don't know the backstory. You know, I think the art is kind of weird, but I really think it's a tasteful way of acknowledging the presence of remains without. It really isn't this wall isn't like a tourist attraction. I've been there 3 times, and I've spent many hours, and I've never once seen anyone taking a picture in front of it. People, you know, look at it. They don't know the significance of the quote. Huh? Most people have no clue I'm just telling you. I know you may not believe me, but most people have no idea what's there. It's really not it's not a museum exhibit in the way that many families think it is. Yeah.
That area we're talking about right now, isn't it designated flood zone?
It was a flood zone before they plugged the reason that it flooded during Hurricane Sandy was they hadn't finished waterproofing it. They hadn't it was a construction site. So again, you know, I mean, that's,
I just want to interject
Yeah.
for the record. It is in flood zone A. It's the
well, of course it's a flood zone. That's why the bathtub is there. That's why the bathtub was built there originally. It's not built on solid ground, but
someday that's going to be underwater. It will be. That's what the
Yeah.
environmentalist people say. So I just wanted to.
yeah, well, I'm not going to get into that. And I know that there are some I disagree on some things with some families. That's, you know, it's the way it is. Just really quickly, I want to end here so we can talk. The main conclusion that I come to from all of this is that when it comes to identification of the missing, science is a very small part of the story. It's an important part of the story, but it's a small part. Even the best forensic recovery effort won't produce lasting social value when politics, culture, personal perception, and emotion are not taken into account and appropriately addressed. I could talk a little bit more. The one thing that I wanted to raise, I asked some audiences, was $80 million worth it? Should the identification effort have been promised to continue into perpetuity? I say no. But in March, another victim was identified, and it happened to be a graduate of Carnegie Mellon. And I was talking to a colleague of mine who had read my book, and she was actually in tears. And she said, I taught him. His name was, I think it was Michael David Yarnell or David Michael Yarnell. I can't remember now. But it was a kid who was, 25 or 26 years old. And he had graduated from Carnegie Mellon and was working for one of the bond traders. And they just identified part of his body. And I don't know exactly the story behind it, but his family said, listen, we knew the whole time that he was gone, but still it's nice to have a physical remains. So I don't personally think this kind of endless identification effort is worth it, but some families do. And I talked about the stakeholder thing. If you're gonna give families a say, you better listen to them. If you're not gonna give them a real say, don't waste anyone's time and be honest about it. Take time before you begin to plan the memorial. And I think the last point that I want to leave us with is what the concept of sacred space means in a situation like the World Trade Center site. There are completely reasonable reasons to rebuild bigger and better. There are reasons why you might want to wipe the entire, just wipe the site clean and not do anything with it, turn it into a park. There are lots of different reasons why you would do all of these things. But I think that when this happens next, I hope it doesn't happen, but I think it will. I think that we need to think very carefully about what we mean by sacred space and what our obligations to the dead are and to the families. And hopefully we'll learn something from this story and not repeat the same mistakes again. So I'm going to stop there, and we can just have questions. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's a personal
Yeah.
thought that you might have. Who owns the dead from 9/11? In your opinion?
State law,
Is
New York
it-
state
is
law,
it-
federal law.
Well, I know that. I went to court. We went to court regarding this. But in your opinion,
Yeah.
should the 1,100 families who still do not have identification, or the nearly 3,000 people who some have had identification, some have not, have ownership to those human remains, or should the human remains belong to the city of New York as the court deems? So I just want to know what your, philosophy is on this.
Yeah, I've thought a ton about this issue actually, and I think the safest answer is to say that families should have the right to decide as a group. They should be polled in the same way that they were polled, or they were asked to give memorabilia or how they wanted their loved ones' names written in the memorial, those kinds of things. The reality is much more complicated, though. I think I think there are competing interests. I think that there is an economic interest. There are residents at the site. So in some cases, I think families should be listened to as much as they can, but I do think in certain cases decisions have to be made by politicians that go against the wishes of families. But you have to provide reasons, and I think what was missing in many cases was a good reason for why some of the decisions were made. And I think families were either left to fill in the blanks or were just left out in the cold. And so for me, it's you do the right thing as much as you can, which I think is listen to what families want. And when you can't do those things, and I mean, I'm not going to sit here and create hypotheticals, you provide real reasons that don't involve your own political future for why you're doing what you're doing. And I really do think that was missing. And I think as humans, we all know that we don't always get what we want, but we're much more satisfied when we feel like we've been given a legitimate explanation for why we don't get what we want. And so I think that's what was missing. So, you know, the question of who owns the dead, in some ways can never fully be answered. But when decision makers make decisions that go against the wishes of families, they need good reasons. They need reasons that go beyond their presidential future, quite frankly.
But you're dealing with politicians. That's the number one thing.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Oh.
According to New York State statutes, did you examine the statutes? Is that in the book?
Well, I mean, it's in there, but the law is that a family has when you can link. I mean, I don't remember the exact wording, but if you can link a remain to a family, they have the right to determine the disposition of that remain. When there's no link, the state decides, the government decides. So that's the bottom line.
And if they should identify the remains of one of the terrorists, what is the law require?
So they have identified the remains of some of the terrorists. What happens is, or what has happened is that the remains are stored off-site, according to OCME, in a different place. And I totally believe them on this. I don't think they would lie about this. But they store them elsewhere. And in order for those remains to be returned to the family or to the country, the government or the family would have to request them. And there's a simple procedure for doing that. But no government or family will ever request the remains, because that would demonstrate the complicity of that individual in the attacks. So they'll remain unclaimed forever.
So the families have not claimed, the families of terrorists have not shown up at all.
No, because they don't want to admit that their loved ones are complicit. So, oh, yeah.
Can you speak up, because we have no...
They have they have samples for some of the terrorists from. Again, I don't remember, maybe blood, because many of them are living in the country. They were living in the United States, so they may have searched their personal effects. They may have gone to doctors. I honestly don't remember how they have samples, but for some they do. I don't know how. You know, the government has its ways. They can do some things. Yeah, ma'am, and then sir behind Sally. Yeah.
I think that the decision to make Judge Hellerstein in charge of all of the cases of people, allowing no testimony on liability, only property damages, and all of the things that had to do with the museum and the memorial, I think those decisions were made at the same time they decided to do 9/11.
That I'm not gonna. I don't make any statements on what the what the reasons for why 9/11 happened. I accept the story for the sake of telling the story, and I leave those things aside. Sir, yeah.
I'd like to go back to the city medical examiner's office. Did you personally speak to them?
Yeah, many of them. Yeah.
Can you kind of share with us if they updated any of their equipment between now and 2016?
When you say
In the past?
which equipment? I mean, they into the
DNA.
The DNA.
Oh yeah, they have they have a state-of-the-art DNA facility, and when new techniques become available, they do retest. I don't know if they retest everything. They retest some of the remains.
The 24/7 operation?
No, certainly not. No. They're not constantly retesting. They only retest when they have a new technology or when they have reason to believe that they can identify a new remain. I mean, I'm not here to question every motive of every person involved in the recovery. I think that I don't have, there are lots of things that I think that I don't have evidence for, and I don't speak without evidence. And so I don't have any evidence to suggest that in that case, there's any malfeasance or dishonesty on the part of OCME. Just like I think that in the early days of the operation, they acted with the best of intentions, used the best possible science, and did the best job they could. And where I see deviances or divergences from best practice, I highlight them in the book. But I don't think, short of a few politicians and some of the people who stood a lot to gain, I don't think people were inherently evil. I think many people believed that the best thing to do was to move forward and to get the site back to normal, and made decisions for complex reasons, but not out of malice or spite. I think some decisions were made purely for pragmatic or egotistical or political expediency, but I don't attribute evil to many of the decisions. There were a few that I do, and I'm very honest about it in the book, and even hinted.
Federal crime. Why do we have a city agency doing the DNA? Why wasn't the federal government involved with this?
To be quite honest with you, I think that OCME is a very good organization in terms of the DNA side. Obviously, we know there are lots of troubles there. The FBI lab has had its fair share of scandals as well. There's no government agency that's perfect. And so I think that you have to, as a family member, you're free to believe what you want to believe. I'm not going to tell you what to believe and what not to believe. But I will say, of all the organizations that do DNA testing, I trust OCME as much as any other. I'm not saying I trust them 100%, but I don't think that anything deliberately malfeasant was happening at OCME. I don't think so.
Not the testing side, but on the recovery end.
Oh, the recovery was a disaster, and I'm very clear about that in the book. The recovery was a complete disaster, partly because OCME wasn't involved in it, because they had forensic anthropologists who would have asked for things to be done differently, but because they weren't consulted, the fire department used its own methods, which were not best practices, and caused trouble. And the city wanted to have things moved out quickly, so they bulldozed stuff into trucks and cleaned off the trucks and moved it to a distant location. That was a mistake. That was a bad decision.
With dollar signs.
I'm sorry, I think
Yeah.
what he was trying to say is why, when this was such a huge federal crime, in the hierarchy of things,
Well,
why
because-
was it decided that instead the local?
I think the federal government was heavily involved with funding and expertise as well. But
Hands-on?
they weren't in the lab. Well, they weren't in the lab doing the work, but they were consulted. The Department of Justice set up the kinship analysis panel to work out the statistics. So
I'm talking about comparing Washington, D.C. to the World Trade Center. I know it's a completely different disaster.
well, because it was, it was the criminal investigation was closed quickly, and it became, according to the people who were involved, it became a local issue. It was a big one, and the federal government was involved, and it would have been very beneficial for the federal government to be involved in the recovery. I think that was a huge mistake.
And I think particularly, we know the city rejected federal resources. We know they did that.
Yeah.
I mean, there were federal
Yeah.
resources that were offered on a variety of levels, beyond even
Yeah.
what we're talking about now. But what's important to point out too is, and again, much smaller part of 9/11, but Flight 93, every single one of the people on the plane, including the terrorists, were identified. Every single one of them. Why? One of the reasons why is because the feds had their DMOR teams. These are teams that are deployed after disaster to organize the efforts. So this, and again, just the fire department certainly played a role here, but I've talked to enough firefighters who said They were down there for the first couple of weeks figuring that, okay, we're going to pick up what we can here, identify the remains. But a couple of them told me, says, we expected in a week or two that this other group of people would have come in and taken this over who were professionals in dealing with this. And that, of course, never happened. And to me, personally, I mean, I could blame the ME's office for that because they did not step forward and insist.
I don't think, I don't think they had, I mean, I don't think they had.
They had jurisdiction. They certainly had jurisdiction, and they.
I don't think they felt that they would have gotten far. I think that the city wanted to recover. You know, the politicians who had national ambitions wanted to do it themselves, and I think that's if you want to blame it on someone, you blame it on the city officials who said we can do this. We're New York, without saying, listen, this is bigger than us.
Go to the city officials to make that determination. Who was the city's authority to say, we're taking this over, federal government step back, when it was
yeah, I think it was partly heat of the moment. I mean, I'm not, you know, there's plenty of stuff that went, I don't need to like surmise and speculate to point out problems with the recovery effort. So I stick to what I know. There may have been an entire conspiracy. The whole thing may have been planned, but I don't have any evidence for that, so I'm just not going there. What I'm doing is I'm focusing on what I can see and what was clear from evidence. It was clear from the statements that Giuliani and Pataki were making that they wanted to do this themselves. Pataki wanted control of the redevelopment. It's obvious the way that he structured the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation through the state that he wanted the Republican infrastructure of New York to control the redevelopment. And you don't need conspiracy theories. You know, you don't need to get into the kind of unseen world, unsubstantiated world to make those claims. So there are lots of other books and lots of other resources on, you know, the government did it. Did the government do it? I don't think so, but maybe. Was there a conspiracy within the OCME? There are lots of venues for that. I wanted to stick to what I could prove, and that's what I did in this book. And I think that's why the city and city officials, while they haven't come out to praise me, I haven't heard a peep. I haven't heard a peep from anyone arguing that I'm wrong. So, sorry. I just wanted to let the woman right there speak, and then. Is it Al? No. Al. Okay, Al, and then and then Eileen. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. We'll come back, and then. But I want to let everyone who hasn't had a chance to talk. So you can speak next after Eileen. Yeah. Go ahead.
Does your book involve the treatment of the first responders?
No, that's a different issue. It's a really important issue, but I just couldn't cover. Yeah, it's.
Yeah, like
Pure the health issues. Yeah. And you know what? Again, that's something you don't need to delve into the world of conspiracy to realize how bad that situation was handled. You just need to look at the facts as they are that everyone can agree on. So what I tried to do was I tried to stick to things that everybody could agree on, even if they disagreed with my interpretation. Like, I don't want the factual record to be impeachable here because I'm making a claim about big problems with the way that the recovery effort was undertaken, and that's the level. That's where I wanted to stop. So yeah, Al. Sorry. Yeah, Al was next, and then Eileen.
From your research, were you able, or are you able to determine that all these diversions, the JPAC, the names, rank and title, all these little side issues were thrown out to feed the family, to keep the families off of the overall picture of moving this thing forward so fast? Could you determine that at all? We fought one battle after another battle after another, and the big picture was not being fought. Yeah. We were fighting all these little minuscule issues.
Yeah. Well, whether that was in.
Created those issues.
No, we didn't create the
I was on something to fire department.
So here's my take. I've got two takes. I don't think the city was competent enough to create diversions that would get you moving, but what they were really good at doing, which I think many families fed into and necessarily was relitigating the same issue over and over again. So I think you as a community probably fought the same issue, every issue multiple times, and again, whether it was, I don't have evidence to suggest that there were people in a back room somewhere plotting to force you to relitigate what's going to happen to the remains every year, but that's what happened. And the situation itself was so dysfunctional, I don't think that they needed any additional plotting. And, I think that it's, I'll just say there's no evidence for me to suggest what you're arguing. I think that's the practical reality. I think that you ended up relitigating the same issues that had been closed many times, but because you had to, as a group of activists. And I don't necessarily agree with every position family groups took, and I've been more open about that since I finished the book. But my goal was to understand the perspective of families. I mean, really, I don't say that, but I wanted to understand families that seemed crazy to me when I started doing the research. I'm going to be honest with you. I thought there was I actually thought the kind of grief police narrative was right. And I think that there are many people involved who I respect a lot who still think that was the case. But I wanted to present the best case I could for the reality of the claims that families were making, and to refute the ones that were incorrect. So, I had conversations with Sally and a few others about when the remains were still kept in tents. I was told by several families that there's garbage there, there's graffiti, there's this, there's people drinking, there's terrible things happening. And I went down there and none of that was happening. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to provide the most factually unimpeachable, clear narrative of the story of the human remains as I could. And that meant that, lots of things that people told me on both sides, when there wasn't evidence for it, I didn't include it. So I only included things that I had evidence for. So, and I'm sure you guys, many of you believe a lot of things that I either don't believe or I don't have evidence for, and they're not in the book. So, yeah. Eileen, and then I don't know your name, sorry. Paul? Okay. Eileen, Paul.
Back to what Maureen was saying about who owns the dead.
Yeah.
Of the remains that are not identified, or some are identified and the families not identified. When we filed a petition to have the remains at grade level, I think if it were approved, families who had their loved ones identified would not be included in a poll for what should happen to the remains that are there.
Yeah.
I think Maureen's question is that
well, I think all the families, so in that case, all of the families, if you're going to be democratic about it, all the victims' families deserve to be polled because there are unidentified remains.
Right.
Yeah.
My was, and that's what I said, I still feel all families should be polled, and the remains still belong to all of us.
Yes, I agree with that.
After that, after we filed it and it was turned down in the courts, a year later, March 17, 2015, I got another phone call from the MU's office that my son was identified again. So that was the fourth or fifth call.
Yeah.
So it proved that point of that my son still could be there. Everything was very minute.
Yeah.
But the point is that his remains still could be there.
Oh, I take that. So I actually took that point for granted. When I say the families, I don't separate the families of those who have had remains and those who haven't, because we know. Oh yeah, no. I mean, it's all. If you're going to be democratic about it, it's all families. The reality is those remains are never going to be put above ground because the memorial is there to allow the rest of the site to be redeveloped. I mean, I think that's a claim that I feel comfortable making, and I think there's a lot of evidence. I don't have definitive evidence, but I think they did as much as they needed to do to allow the retail and business and residential life to return to the area. And you know what? I don't like the way that it happened, but I do think that life should return to that space. I don't think that I personally, and again, you may disagree with me, I don't think that we should take these sites, particularly of terrorist attacks, and cede that ground to the people who did it. I think that we need to return life to the space. That's my own belief. It's not in the book. It's not in the book, but that's my personal belief.
Enough space on those 11 acres to have something above ground as a memorial to like an unknown source. Because people go and pay. I had relatives from South Africa, from Scotland, from England, and then cross country who came. They did go down to the museum. And I went down so far, and I said, fine. And and I have nothing against how the museum remains there. So there is plenty of ground outside that they could have set aside. That if people just wanted to go there and pay respect to the remains.
But that's
against the. It was sort of against the architect's rendition of what they wanted to see there. So they didn't want to change that.
Yeah, but they also don't want. I mean, they don't want to remind. My opinion is that everyone in charge, everyone involved in New York and with the Museum and Memorial doesn't want people to. They don't want people to remember death, and it's the death part that I think.
Then you distort in history. Then you distort in history. This is part of history.
I mean, yes. But we distort history all the time. I mean, history is not an unbiased, neutral account of the past. It's an account of the past that allows us to do certain things in the present. And so, I'm a realist in that respect. I just think it was I think it was poorly messaged. There was just a breakdown in the kind of communication that should have happened. There was active deception about the role that families would play, and I detail that in the book. And nobody's questioned me or said I was wrong. I mean, maybe there'll be some big review coming in which city officials tell me I'm wrong, but I haven't heard anything from anyone. And that was the goal of the book, was not to be. Not to have any one side say that I got the facts wrong. Interpretations are interpretations, but I didn't want the facts to be wrong, and that's what I tried to do in the book. So Arnie's going to. So well, did you? Sorry, behind Arnie, ma'am, did you have your hand up? And then Paul.
The answers to the question, one
Yeah.
of the questions that I had, was just like, all the families were they all in agreement, or were they separate?
No, families definitely. You can't get 10. You ask 10 people about something, you're going to get 11 opinions. But
In agreement, I'm sorry. In agreement about what?
Basically about the whole structure.
Okay, the families, I understand what you're saying, and I appreciate that. The families were never, ever surveyed.
Yeah.
We were never asked, there was never one single meeting for all the 11 families, or even for the ones that could get there. It was not a democratic process. And I know in the book, you mentioned, first of all, I want to say your book, this should be required reading for like every student, because, and everyone should read this book because of your meticulous research, and also with all the 9/11 books that have come out in the last 15 years, this is the only one that addresses the families of the victims and how this process really failed. So it's astounding that you were able to do this. I'm in a state of shock, because honestly, when I met you many years ago and I spoke to you, I've spoken to hundreds of reporters and documentary makers and this and that, whatever. Well, some, but you know what? No one ever gave the families a voice. No one ever put any of these issues, so you have to be commended with that. But there's one, little thing that.
I want to. Can I? Let me just say one more thing. So the families were actively divided by the city. They were divided up into groups and pitted against each other. And they were. And I think that they were never given the opportunity to have some kind of like a democratic process, a survey, a vote. There was that. They sure as heck managed to get to all the families to ask for donations and to ask for names, but not on the issue of like, what do you want to happen? But again, when you have a democratic processes aren't perfect. So I don't think there was any one. No, I'm saying even if there had been, it wouldn't have made everyone happy. But the point is that there was an active attempt not to have a democratic process, and I think that's where the problem is. a non-democratic process that was passed off as democratic, and that's what I think was wrong. If you're not going to be democratic, just don't be democratic, and get on with it. Yeah, and then I wanted Paul, to have a chance.
That is an interesting thing that you just said about pitting the families against each other, because I was on a community board.
Mm-hmm.
I live in Lower Manhattan. I was on a community board. And the LMDC very effectively pitted the families against the residents.
Yeah, for sure.
And
yeah.
I was at many meetings, and the operative word down there was just time to move on.
Mm-hmm.
This is what they would say. I mean, I was not a lone wolf, but
yeah.
there were very few people on the community board who felt like the whole process was really not good.
Mm-hmm.
It was
yeah.
ugly.
Yeah.
And I remember residents, especially from Veteran Park City, saying, "Oh, the memorial, we have to have it so we can walk through it on our way to work."
Mm-hmm.
And there was such insensitivity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I would storm on me. I just couldn't deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
Madeline was a neighbor of mine. She and I would go at it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And,
yeah.
So it's there is a lot of people, a lot of residents who are very sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
Not
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
all
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
residents are
Yeah.
not. But it's I looked through your book a little bit and I saw your reference to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that was the part that really got me, was how that you could kind of see the subtle ways that and not so subtle ways that city officials and LMDC would create divisions within families, and then, you know, they brought Edie Lutnick in to kind of be a family member who would counteract the crazy family members, and she turned out to side with, you know, the family members who are causing trouble. And so, you know, I think that she had the same reaction. You know, it's funny, when I read her like memoir of the situation, I got the same feeling as she did, that, you know, there were these families that the LMDC wanted they wanted them to be able to speak so that they could say that they spoken, but they didn't want to listen, and they wanted them neutralized. And that was what her function was supposed to be in the Family Advisory Council, and that turned out to be, you know, she went the other way. And so, you know, you can see these things kind of happening all the time. Yeah, Arnie.
Yeah, I first want to echo what Sally said.
And then I'll let Sally finish. I cut her off to make sure that everybody could talk.
But I think your book was very fair and balanced, and I like the way you presented all sides with facts. It was almost like in the middle of writing something, you had a fact check. But I want to go back to sort of different what people were talking about. My background is sociology and a community organizer. And the phrase you said when you first heard what these family members were doing, they were crazy. I mean, that's a typical reaction when someone speaks out and challenges the system.
Yeah.
What I was interested in, I don't think it's in your book, and I like to see someone do it, looking at how the family, you made the point in the beginning to say, these were men and women who were apolitical, and all of a sudden an event happened and they became political. I'm fascinated by that process, predominantly, you know, predominantly women. Before there were the factions in the early days, families, regardless of what you might say was their political ideology, were in unity.
Yeah.
In that early days, there was a solidarity among the family members, and then there was a split.
Yeah.
But I'd like to see someone write a book about when this, God forbid, happens again.
Yeah.
How families organize, and these attempts by the city and organizations to split the family and counteract it.
So I think the initial, first of all, I'm not a psychologist or a sociologist or a social worker or anyone who understands how people interact with one another at a professional, you know, I mean, I can do it as an amateur for sure. But I think that that's something you see universally. I think you see women who, mostly women. What's interesting about the 9/11 case is that male firefighters had the same social status as wives and mothers have in other places, and, you know, they were sort of seen as these people who are demanding information, and I think the initial unity comes from a demand for information from the state, you know, not state meaning like the state of New York, but from the government, and as questions turn into what is to be done and what is justice, those are really difficult questions to agree upon. And what I've discovered since Trump was elected was that even people who I think I agree with on pretty fundamental political principles, we have very different conceptions of what justice is and what is to be done and how we should react and what the future holds. And so I think that it's easy to unite around a sense of loss and a demand for information. It's much harder to unite around questions of what is to be done. And it's also much easier to pull people apart. And I often try and put myself in your position. Like, what would I do? I have 3 kids, what would I do if my kids were in something like this, or my wife, or, family? And I partly say straight out is that I don't think you can ever answer the question until you're in it. You just can't understand. But that was the position that I put myself in when I was writing, was, what if this happened to me? How would I want to be understood? And so I think partly the reason I was able to do what I did was because that was I wasn't like, dazzled by New York real estate or by these big, beautiful buildings or like political machinations. I was really, it was a sort of position of empathy. Like, how would I want to be treated if this was me and I was, and I was sort of in this situation? And the other thing is, I didn't really want to write the book. Like, I didn't want to write the book. I did not want to write about 9/11. I felt compelled to as I got further into the story. And so I think that's, I didn't want to gain anything from it, other than not having to carry those books home to Pittsburgh with me. That, I hope that kind of answers the question. But I think there are books written about how women, particularly in like in South Africa, there's a Mamafela, now I'm blanking on her name, Mamela Ramafela, she wrote a really wonderful piece on political widowhood, and how being a widow or the mother or a relative of someone who's missing gives you special political power that you lose as soon as the remains are identified, because then you just become a mourner and you need to get on with things. But until that happens, you have this political power in society that allows you to make claims against the state that you wouldn't normally make. Whether they're listened to or not, I don't know. I think we're done. Yeah, Sally. And then I'm around. I'm here for another half an hour, so if we can.
Books and.
We can continue. Yeah, we can continue to talk.
I just wanted to say that, first of all, again, I have to reiterate, I want to thank you for writing this book. You did it in a very scientific, non-biased, classical type of way. It's full of facts and it's full of things that 99.9% of the public has no idea about, and people should know about what happened and what's still continuing. Personally, I feel, and many of my colleagues feel, the system, if I may borrow a phrase, contemporary phrase, the system was rigged against the 9/11 families from day one.
Mm-hmm.
It was a, quote, master plan, and I'm always astounded that they could even use a term that has such a negative connotation, a master plan for redevelopment.
Mm-hmm.
That did not include any relatives of the victims or whatever happened to memorialize them. There was a different agenda. When we could not get a survey done, which should have been done from certainly early on to determine not just that little handful of people that were dogged and were on the committees like myself and my colleague and many people in this room, but we were forced to do our own survey. We did it. We did a survey of I'd say maybe 2,000 families. It was a survey, and the results were compiled by the law offices of Norman Siegel, who is one of the most highly respected people, certainly most highly thought of attorneys, and one of them in this city. It was compiled, and the results were 94% of all the respondents rejected their loved ones' remains being in the basement of the museum. The city of New York and the system, they just rejected our survey, right out. However, we had to take them to court twice to force the city just to survey the families. That's all we wanted. And twice we did not prevail, because of whatever. But the thing is, I'll finish by saying in a democratic society, when someone is elected, I'm not talking about the presidential election, but any other election, as Norman Siegel once said to me, all you need is 51%. We should have had choices, and whatever 51%, then that's how it should have been. And when I hear the term, you can't please everyone, and I know that this was said in the beginning, they used that to justify why they were shutting us out. 51% in a democratic society, that's what we wanted, and that's what we did not get. So thank you so much for this book.
Thanks. Thank you.